Good afternoon, everyone. We are live with US and Israel's unprovoked war of aggression on Iran. We're just waiting for a couple of uh, logistical matters. So we'll start in just a few seconds. All right. I think we are ready to go. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad, and I am joined by my co host, Maya Mikdashi, in bringing to you the second in a series of conversations on Iran on the brink. This one is actually titled because the first one took place before the war or before the decision to go to war against Iran by the United States and Israel. This one is called U.S. and Israel's Unprovoked War of Aggression on Iran, and we have with us four, um, what can I say? Four remarkable speakers who will be addressing this topic, various aspects of it, and we also have our co-host Maya Migdashi who will address the Lebanon aspect as well. Nargis Bajogli, Sina Tusi, and Craig Muhayber will be joining us. I will say something about their bios, but first, how's everybody doing?
Hang in there.
Not too good, to be honest with you.
Yep.
Hard
Well,
question these days.
yep, that reflects the mood that's prevalent right now. I look forward to a very informative and insightful discussion, not least because some of what we hear is very much depends on what someone is watching. So those of us who are actually watching various sources might bring to this conversation material that are not necessarily evident to all our viewers. Uh, Let me start by saying that I will introduce everyone right now so that we don't have to introduce people's bios, and I'll only read a part so that people who would like to read more can go to the website on Jadalia and read the full bio. First, my co host Maya Mikdashi is an associate professor at Rutgers University and co editor of Jadalia. Ahlan wa sahlan, Maya. Nargis Bajogli is a writer, scholar, and public intellectual whose work explores the intersections of revolutions, media, and war in global politics. She is an associate professor of anthropology and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where she co-directs the Rethinking Iran initiative and leads the Paradox Human Stories Lab, a space for ethnographic research and storytelling, as well as multimedia engagement. Her first book is Iran Reframed: Anxieties of Power in the Islamic Republic, out of Stanford University Press. Sina Tusi is a senior non resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. His work focuses on producing research and analysis on U.S. Iran relations, U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East, and nuclear policy issues. His writings have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and USA Today, among other outlets. Craig Mkhayber is an international human rights lawyer and former senior United States, Craig, sorry, and former senior United Nations official. He left the UN in October 2023, penning a widely read letter that warned of genocide in Gaza, criticized the international response, and called for a new approach to Palestine and Israel based on equality, human rights, and international law. He has spent 4 decades in the international human rights movement, including more than 30 years at the United Nations. He is former director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Thank you all for joining us. We will get right to it as there's a lot to discuss, and I will start with asking Nargis to share with us some introductory remarks on the internal dynamics right now in Iran, social and political, and maybe a glimpse on the geopolitics, because we will be unpacking this quite a bit throughout. So, Nergis, the floor is yours for your opening remarks, and then we'll go to Sina, and after that, Craig.
Sure. So, in the current moment, all of the conversations that I'm having with folks in Iran is that last week when the war started, there was a bit of tribulation, a bit of worry, because last time around the war, many people, especially in big the capital city of Tehran and other cities, left the cities, and the war ended in about 12 days. And so a lot of people were holding out hope that this time around it would also kind of be a quick war and they could go back to their lives. But it's starting to seem like that's not going to be the case. The ways in which both the US and Israel are bombing major cities, up in Tehran itself, but also outside of Tehran, seems to be quite heavy. This weekend, Trump has promised for it to be one of the heaviest bombing campaigns of the war so far. And I was just got off the phone before I got on here with you all with folks that I know very well in the city of Esfahan, which has not been seeing a large number of bombings. And they said that this morning they are getting bombarded very, very heavily. People are very worried. People are feeling the strength of these bombs in a very particular way. It is, and seeing the rubble that is developing around them. Um, there is the question of whether the United States will use, either in partnership or otherwise, the Kurds to enter from the Iraqi space and have ground troops enter either alongside them or the Kurds themselves enter. That is a part of this wider development, though, from everything that I'm hearing and sort of seeing from within Iran, folks are not as worried about a ground invasion, just given Iran's geography and given sort of the realities on the ground. I think right now what is more worrisome is the prospect of collapse of either the state because of the way that the Americans and Israelis are hitting, and sort of the prolongation of this into a much wider war that sort of leads towards state collapse. As far as Iran's response to this, and I'll only just say a little bit up front, is that they seem to be doing two main things. Um, One obviously is striking at the energy architecture of the United States in the Gulf, and the other is hitting at the energy architecture. They understand that they are outmatched militarily by the United States and Israel, and they can hit back asymmetrically. But what will get ultimately this war to stop is the more that energy prices go up. And so this is part of their strategy and why we see them sort of hitting at regional Gulf states. They're hitting the American bases, but then they're also making it very difficult for these Gulf states to be able to produce and trade their energy. So I'll sort of stop there and then we can continue.
Thank you so much, Nargis, for that initial presentation. I'm sure we will hear more when we're in discussion. And next, we're going to hear from our second guest, Sina Tusi. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I can just talk a little bit up front about what I think are the misperceptions of Iran that got us into this war that is, I would argue, has become a major quagmire, strategic quagmire for the United States. We've seen in Washington, especially over the past year, especially since the last war in June, that there's been a dominant perception that Iran is weak, is a paper tiger, that the regime is brittle, and that one military attack can crumble the regime and give the United States, stoke some major uprising and give the United States a quick victory. This perception, I would argue, has always been based on bad assumptions, not in line with the realities on the ground in Iran. I think the strongest proponents of this perception were Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and various pro-Israel donors and lobbying groups here in the United States, including in the foreign policy establishment here in Washington. And I think Trump more listened to their voices than listened to the voice of his own military and intelligence advisors. I mean, Trump is a president who we know famously does not listen to his military and intelligence briefings. It's significant that both in the lead up to this war and since the war has begun, pretty much every day there's been a steady trickle of leaks, citing Pentagon officials, citing intelligence officials, basically casting doubt on this war, We saw in the lead up to the war, there was leaks from the Pentagon, from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, of them saying that the U.S. is not in a good position for this war. There's various military shortcomings, especially with the interceptor issue. We've seen this week, it seems like every potential scenario is leaked ahead of time, including this issue of, potentially arming the Kurds in Iraq to invade Iran. That was in CNN, that was in Axios. We've seen the New York Times has done multiple reports citing intelligence officials saying that, an uprising was always a remote possibility. Today, there was also a report in the Washington Post, also to this effect, and casting, reflecting I think it was the National Intelligence Council's doubts on a war ever leading to regime change. And this is not the narrative that Netanyahu sold Trump, and a lot of the kind of the echo chamber of bad Iran analysis in Washington has really echoed. And we've seen that, it turns out Iran is not a paper tiger. They hit Iran, they killed Khamenei in the opening blow. What happened was not an uprising, despite many Iranians, having deep-seated grievances, this context of repression. But Iran is not a monolithic society. And I think, they've continued to misread the broader complex dynamics of Iranian society. And we've seen that since then, it is the Islamic Republic's base and beyond that has been in the streets in the thousands, more radicalized. And Iran's regime has not collapsed. There's no sign of regime cohesion faltering. Khamenei was taken out, but by all accounts, Iran had prepared for this war for decades in key ways, but especially even learning the lessons since last June. Since last June, the Iranians very openly telegraphed what they were going to do, and including their political and military strategy, which has been one of dispersion. So they've dispersed the military and political officials. They've dispersed the military infrastructure. Every official has had appointed multiple successors. They've delegated authority to various, provincial authorities. And Iran has, entered this war prepared to go long haul, to raise the cost for the United States. And right now, Khamenei's taken out, but, we see that the other institutions are there and seemingly operating, like Ali Larijani, the Supreme National Security Council. There's an interim leadership council comprised of President Pezeshkian, the judiciary chief, this cleric from the Guardian Council, the military officials. So Trump has really entered a quagmire. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. All the various ramifications and knock-on effects that that's having for the global economy, for the price of gasoline. Europe is even potentially having to import gasoline from Russia again. We've had the biggest price oil hikes in a long time, and I think in 1 week it's been the sharpest, I think, ever. There's these various claims going around, and so there's a real cost for Trump, and that's the leverage that Iran has, in being outmatched by these two nuclear powers that have launched this unprovoked war of aggression on Iran, as you've titled this accurately. That it has leverage in the Persian Gulf, it has leverage in hitting U.S. interests in the region and destabilizing large parts of the region when its own stability has come under attack. So I think right now there's no easy military solution from Trump. There is no military solution. So this could either just get a lot more ugly and brutal, or if he comes to his senses and tries to wash his hands of this and declare some sort of victory and try to get out of it. But even that, I think, would be difficult.
Thanks, Sina. Let me turn to Craig. Craig, you've always joined us for the past couple of years very gracefully and shared with us or informed us about the international law and legal dimensions of the horrific things we have been witnessing, and we are inviting you yet again, to do the same.
Well, I'm happy to do so because it's an easy task that you're giving me, Bassem. You wouldn't know by watching Western media or listening to Western politicians that as a matter of international law, legitimacy falls entirely on the side of Iran. And the acts of the US-Israel axis and their attacks on Iran are entirely unlawful. In fact, not only unlawful, but they constitute the crime of aggression, which I think, as a lot of folks know now, was called at Nuremberg the supreme international crime. It's been called the crime of crimes. So not only is what the United States and Israel doing vis-a-vis Iran unlawful in international law, but it is criminal, and it is a violation of the highest order of international law. And on the other side of that you will also never hear in Western media is that as a matter of international law, the Iranian armed response is entirely justified and entirely lawful. But if you look at this overall, you see there are four categories of law that come into play here, and that are all really easy cases. First is the law of force, aggression, and self-defense. The second is, war crimes, laws relating to war crimes and the conduct of hostilities. The third is arms control and nuclear proliferation, which is often used as a justification for the U.S.-Israeli aggression. And the fourth category is human rights, which comes into this international human rights law in two ways. One is that as the nuclear justification failed in the minds of anyone who exercises logic, much like in Iraq, what we've seen is that the U.S.-Israel axis has tried to invoke human rights as a justification for its crimes in Iran, and what I have written and called the prostitution of human rights. And secondly, the gross violations of human rights that are a part of the U.S. Israel attacks on Iran. I mean, this first category of nuclear hypocrisy and what really is contained in law. You have on the one side Iran, which has renounced the quest for nuclear weapons, has codified that into national law and directive, has ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an instrument in international law, has historically opened itself up to international inspections, even entered into a formal treaty, formal agreement with the US and others that would prevent them from developing nuclear weapons, right? That was the JCPOA, which, by the way, was abandoned by Donald Trump, not by Iran, at the insistence of his Israeli donors, effectively. I think, as has been said before, Iran is not being attacked because it has a nuclear weapon. It's being attacked because it does not have nuclear weapons. And it's viewed as a target that is defeatable by the Axis, despite its size and its military and other considerations, and is the final domino that's standing up against the hegemony of the U.S.-Israel axis and of Israeli dominance in across Western Asia. So that kind of hypocrisy is stunning, because the only party in the region that does have stockpiles of nuclear weapons, entirely undeclared and unsupervised, is the Israeli regime, which was joined in attacking Iran by another nuclear power, the U.S. And remember, Trump has withdrawn from the INF Treaty. He has rejected extension of the New START Treaty. He withdrew from the JCPOA. In other words, I've said two rogue nuclear powers have tried to justify their attacks on a third state that has no nuclear weapons by invoking nuclear control and non-proliferation. And if you add to that the crime of aggression, and you realize that Iran has not initiated a war with any other country literally in centuries, while the US and the Israeli regime have been responsible for most of the military aggression in today's world, with attacks in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Qatar, on and on and on, as well as attacking boats in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. There's no other country in the world that comes as close to the U.S. and Israel for the crime of aggression. But then you have this, okay, folks are not really buying the nuclear justification, and so they shift to human rights justifications as an alternative script of propaganda. So they recycle these old tricks from their attacks on Iraq and Libya, saying they're doing this to protect the human rights of the Iranian people. I mean, this is an outrageous prostitution of the concept of human rights. They started by fabricating and exaggerating claims about the number of protesters killed in the protests in the beginning of the year. Ramping up the numbers as high, I've heard, as 50,000 in some cases, without evidence, even though there is plenty of evidence to the contrary. Ignoring the fact that many of those who were killed by the violent groups that were supported by the U.S. and Israel and their intel agency, trying to stir up violence. The fact that the dead included police and state officials and shopkeepers and others that were attacked by these violent forces, and equally absurdly, trying to say that they're murdering the U.S. and Israel are murdering Iranian women and girls in order to liberate them with feminist bombs. Right? While the attack on Iran itself includes a number of gross violations of human rights for which these regimes could be held accountable. This is the quintessential case of people in glass houses throwing stones. which of course is not to suggest that Iran does not have human rights problems, even serious human rights problems. Every country does, and Iran is certainly no exception. But the idea that these two rogue states, the US and Israel, both of which have horrendous human rights records, and which together have really represented the principal source of suffering across the region for decades, are motivated by concern for human rights is absolutely preposterous. I don't have to go through the litany of violations of human rights perpetrated by Israel all the way up to genocide, and by the US at home and abroad, to point out how ridiculous this argument really is. And then the crime of crimes, right? The attack on Iran by Israel and Axis, is a classic case of aggression, as we said, a crime under international law. And so what they've tried to do is they've tried to dust off these old discredited arguments about preemptive war and anticipatory self-defense, which any international lawyer can tell you is utter nonsense. This was an unprovoked attack on Iran by the US-Israel axis. It's a crime under international law. Article 51 of the UN Charter says that the right to use armed force and claim self-defense can be done only in response to an armed attack. There was no armed attack from Iran, or when specifically authorized by the Security Council, which did not authorize this. Any other act of armed force of this kind is the crime of aggression, which we said is the supreme international crime. That means that the axis of US and Israel is using force against Iran unlawfully in violation of the Charter, and Iran's self-defense is lawful. And we can, I won't go into detail now, but we can talk about why these anticipatory self-defense and preemptive strikes and so on are nonsense under international law and in the facts of the case. But this is prohibited action very, very clearly, even under the 19th century rules of the use of force, as I have written. So, what you basically have is the U.S. and Israel taking this to extremely absurd levels, right? They claim that they have the right to attack anybody who might someday in the future decide to attack them. That is an absurd argument. This idea that Iran may one day develop nuclear weapons. It may one day use them on Israel or the US if it develops them, and therefore the Axis has no choice but to attack Iran now. That is entirely without merit. If that were the rule, it would mean that any state could lawfully attack any other state on the planet just by claiming a potential future threat of some kind. And that means that you annul the UN Charter and you plunge the world into a state of permanent, unrelenting violence. So there is no credible argument about the legality of what the US and Israel have done in the attack. And then I just, to finish up, within that attack, beyond the aggression itself, they have perpetrated a number of war crimes, grave breaches of international humanitarian law. They're basically applying what has been called the Dahiya doctrine of the Israelis, named after the Beirut suburbs that have been, pulverized over and over again by Israeli forces, an approach that's designed to impose maximum civilian suffering, targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, courthouses, sports facilities, everything, to try to destroy the country and to bring it to its knees. And they have already killed something like 1,500 Iranians. They've wounded many thousands more. They've killed almost 200 children, according to the current statistics, including, as we all know, at least 165 schoolgirls between the ages of 7 and 12 in what we understand was a double-tap strike on a school in Menab, the schoolgirl massacre. Alongside military targets, they've attacked civilian neighborhoods, apartment buildings, civilian infrastructure, as I said, hospitals and schools. They're also attacking police stations, which under international humanitarian law are civilian targets. These on their face violate the principles of international humanitarian law. We can go into detail if folks have questions. But I just say there's one other act here, which is a grave breach of international humanitarian law, which is the targeting of nuclear sites, which is an extremely dangerous thing, which is happening now for the second time, which is absolutely prohibited under international humanitarian law. There's a lot to say about the nature of these breaches, but let me just close by saying it's not a difficult case. It's not something happening in the gray area. These are direct violations of international law. The legality stands on the side of Iran in this conflict, not on the side of the U.S. Israel axis. And that's precisely why we hear nothing about international law from Western politicians and Western media corporations who have tried to paint a completely different picture. This is an assault on Iran, but much like what has been happening in Palestine and Lebanon and across the region, it is also a direct assault on international law, which the US and the Israelis find as inconvenient for their plans of forced hegemony across the region.
Thank you, Greg. In fairness, Carney, the great leader of Canada, did mention that international law is important, and then the United States is discarding it. And then when the war in Iran started, he sided with the United States, which is, at least it's half right. Maya, we are going to go to you next to share with us the developments in Lebanon, which are, as we all know, always very simple when we talk about Lebanon. If you can just put things in perspective, especially that there's so much out there about how Hezbollah started the violations or the war or what have you. And we would like you to just frame things for us. And we will come back to you.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm just gonna give a short sort of background to the context in which this is taking place in Lebanon. The war has accelerated in Lebanon. As a reminder, this is not the beginning, this is an acceleration. When we talk about Lebanon, since November of 2024, the ceasefire agreement that was signed with Israel, Israeli attacks have persisted. The Lebanese government and UNIFIL have logged over 15,000 ceasefire violations up to February 2026, and almost 100 people have been killed in Lebanon by the Israeli army. About 370 people have been killed. These attacks were already creating waves of displacement, and just as importantly, were about making sure that thousands of Lebanese people could not return to their homes in South Lebanon. When prior to this particular acceleration, about 60,000, if not a little bit more, Lebanese were still displaced from their homes in villages in South Lebanon, which, in addition to facing, evacuation orders, they were also attacks on any attempt to rebuild homes, and even sort of infrastructure that was meant for rebuilding. When we look at this, I don't think it is surprising. It is part of the MO of Israeli interpretations of what a ceasefire is. And that is that you cease and we continue to fire. This is what we've been seeing also in Gaza and in Lebanon. And, part of this is that the use of a ceasefire to effectively create a depopulated DMZ buffer zone in South Lebanon. This is a plan that is also being put into place in Gaza under the so-called ceasefire. And within this here, over 10,000, just until January, 10,000 buildings, civilian buildings and infrastructure have been destroyed in South Lebanon. Now, under the ceasefire agreement signed in November 2024, Lebanon's military was supposed to deploy alongside UNIFIL peacekeepers, and the Israeli army was supposed to withdraw from Lebanon in an initially a 60-day period, and then that was extended until February 18th, just this February past, so like a little bit more than a week ago. 2 days before that deadline, on February 16th, the Israeli army announced that it will not withdraw from 5 key points on the border with Lebanon that are and they effectively announced that they had no intention of leaving and that they were going to, in fact, continue and extend a military occupation of these few points. It's within this context that this particular round began. And I think part of what's very frustrating when you look at corporate news coverage is that, violence, we only start counting when it is attacks, when it's not attacks by Israel, which have just been sort of normalized and almost made into sort of a phenomena, like, yeah, they're going to happen. So, within this context, on March 2nd, 6 rockets were fired from the south of the Litani into northern Israel. Hezbollah later claimed that this was a response to the continued Israeli ceasefire violations and the assassination of Khamenei. More recently, the head of Hezbollah, Secretary General Naim Qassem, also said that this was under the knowledge that there was an impending Israeli strike. And this, in fact, was confirmed by the Israeli chief of staff, who said in an interview that they were planning to attack Lebanon and that the rockets that were fired from Lebanon happened only hours before that planned attack. Over 100,000 troops have been called up in Israel to fortify and part the northern border. This is the context in which we should read these events. It's the context in which we should read the implementation of the Dahi doctrine, again in Dahi and also in South Lebanon, between the 3rd and 6th of March. So as of yesterday, the Israeli army has in effect put 1 million people in Lebanon under an evacuation order. This is about a quarter of the country. And this is not only affect Lebanese, it affects everyone who lives in these territories, which includes Palestinian refugees, Syrians, migrant laborers. Everybody is clogged onto the streets and trying to move to safety within an already very dilapidated infrastructure. And this is also understood, and we should understand it, as an intentional pressure point aimed at the social fabric of Lebanon, which is a tactic that we have seen before over and over again. As a reminder, this would be the sixth invasion of Lebanon, sixth Israeli invasion of Lebanon. As of, again, today, 217 people have been killed in Lebanon and about 800 injuries have been reported by the Lebanese Ministry of Health. And just yesterday, we saw an attempted on the ground, I mean, I hate this word, but nothing else is coming to mind, incursion into the Bekaa, a village and town in the Bekaa, that was repelled, but with serious casualties. As the war continues to really escalate in very unpredictable ways, we're watching both sides of the border for these invasions and infiltrations. And we've already started to see a lot of the ramifications locally on the national scale in Lebanon. I think the regional, international scale, those are the three scales that we should be reading all of this on. And we will, I'm sure we can talk about this, if not on this session, later sessions. But as an initial sort of framing device, I think it's really important to know when things begin and when things end. And things don't begin only when there is a response to Israeli war crimes, escalation, and occupation. And I think that is probably the most important reframing that needs to happen, to remind people that the ceasefire had already been violated more than 15,000 times by Israel in Lebanon without any response by Hezbollah before March 2nd.
Thanks, Maya. um, Always good to hear from you and from everyone. I would like to move to a few other topics, and I'm hoping that this will also take us spontaneously to whatever you'd like to address. But I will start with this idea that the war has expanded, or that Iran has expanded the war as a result of the initial strikes, or after the initial strikes. And that word, even that word, the expansion of the war into the Arab Gulf region, masks what's actually happening, which is, of course, the American bases that are stationed there, from which America benefits, uses, and launches attacks. So I would like you to address the broader regional dimensions, not least in relation to the strikes on American bases, or as the CIA says, assets. We all learn. And then, second, the question of the utilization of groups, paramilitary forces, and what have you, by the United States as a potential card in terms of the ground invasion, including factions within the Kurdish forces. And if you can also share with us uh, anything you think impinges on this broader setting. And I'll start with Nargis and Sina, and then Craig, feel free to also share with us the question of legality, because sure, the U.S. is using these bases, but if you can tell us a little bit about, within this context, does international law say something about this, given that the reality is rational, as in you're striking who's striking you, even if they are somewhere that has not initiated uh, a war or a strike by the actual sovereign state. We would actually like to know what the situation there, if you'd like to share with us. And Maya, will come back to you and address some of the details regarding the recent operation by Israel and the ramifications that took place in Lebanon in the past 36 hours. Nargis, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks for that, Bassam. Okay, so I want us to start back a little bit in order to understand why we're here where we are. And that is that all of these Persian Gulf bases, United States bases, were developed post Iranian Revolution. So they started to come into being after the revolution in Iran in 79, which had at its core a project of independence and sovereignty for Iran and getting rid of the US presence within Iran and more broadly within the broader region. Um, with the hostage taking in Iran, the first warships began to arrive in the Persian Gulf and as temporary, sort of to be there on a temporary basis. And over time, they all developed into eventually permanent bases across the Persian Gulf countries. And these bases were set up, and then the way that they would develop throughout the past 4.5 decades is as primarily a way to contain Iran and to isolate it in different ways. When Iran came under attack in June and sort of moving forward, it made it very clear that because Iran cannot reach the United States with its weaponry, that the way that they have to fight the Americans is by doing so from all of the bases that it utilizes to wage the war on Iran. And so it has been quite forthcoming, both in back channels as well as in public channels, that they are shooting missiles and drones into these bases as American bases and not as territory of these countries, because the countries had given and rented their territory to the Americans for these bases. And Iran is also targeting their radars and their interceptors as a logistical way to try to fight this broader war with the United States, because the United States is using all of these places to wage the war on Iran. Um, into that fold, obviously, is also the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei has a very complex and multi layered meaning and relationship with the Iranian population. And that's something that we can get into later. But to stick to sort of this framing on the region, Khamenei played a particular role and he had a particular symbolism across the region and in particular across the Shia world. That relationship is in many ways fundamentally different than what is the how we can think about it in the domestic states space within Iran. On top of the assassination of Khamenei, who sort of holds this figure of not just a leader of a nation state, but also a spiritual leader of many Shias around the world, his assassination happening within the month of Ramadan, closely followed by very religious and crusade like language from American officials. Lindsey Graham, Pete Hegseth, Trump himself having the evangelical pastors at the White House a couple of days ago and praying over him and using incredibly charged religious language in doing so. The list goes on and on and on across the American evangelical space and the way in which they are talking about this war as a necessity to bring about the end of times. That language is being broadcast across the Middle East in real time. And it is causing a particular kind of response and reaction that is unfolding that we also have to understand about broadly what's going on. So now it is being sort of framed as a modern 21st century crusade by decision makers and policymakers within the United States, by decision makers and policymakers within Israel itself, and then to have it happen alongside the assassination of Khamenei, in the war now with Lebanon, and in particular the ways that it is being carried out on southern Lebanon and being seen and being read by again the wider Shia world and as a war and as an existential war on Shias in first and foremost. Um, these are the regional implications of part of what is developing. What is also important here is that the Graham and others have also been speaking very loudly about the need for because they're trying to get the Saudis and the other Gulf countries involved in the war and to against Iran. The Saudis and the Gulf countries have been extremely reticent to do that to this at this stage and have been increasingly saying that we are not going to fall into the trap of the Israelis and the Americans to have the Arabs and Iranians fight each other and sort of deplete one another. And the winner in the end will be Israel in that. And so this is also the kind of conversation that is happening on that end and that needs to be paid attention to. And there is an increasing sort of talk because, again, of the symbolism of all of this happening in Ramadan, because of the charged religious language, you are also getting an increase of sentiment of that this is a war on Islam more broadly and the region, and then therefore there needs to be a unity among Shias and Sunnis. All of this is in the mix right now. And then on top of that, the United States and all of these leaks that we were just previously talking about the arming of the Kurds, and lately, since yesterday, an increase in aggressive conversation between Azerbaijan, the country of Azerbaijan, and Iran. This is all sort of has already spilled out into a broader regional war, but it has the potential to escalate at extremely high rates, and that has spillover effects everywhere because, as I was saying earlier, while all of this is happening, Iran is also striking at and really impacting the energy infrastructure and really trying to, and it has signaled this from before, that if Iran gets attacked illegally as it has, then it will not just be Iran that will feel the consequences of this, that the consequences of this will need to be felt more globally because this is a violation of, as Craig was saying before, a multiple sets of global agreements, understandings, and laws.
Sina, would you like to address the regional quote unquote expansion question and related matters that you feel impinge on this broader topic?
Yeah, sure. I would just emphasize that these regional countries did not want this war. The GCC countries have actually been on a path of détente with Iran for the past several years. And for exactly what we're seeing play out is why they have chosen that policy of détente, even though Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, they were actually in Trump's first term some of the architects of Trump's very hawkish Iran policy. But I think they actually reacted much more rationally and didn't fall into this trap of viewing Iran as a paper tiger, because you saw in Trump's first term, much like preceding this war, Iran's capabilities were put on display, and that kind of raise the cost for them. So in 2019, for example, Saudi Aramco was hit. There were certain tankers that were hit. And so they kind of pivoted off that path and moved towards engagement with Iran. Now, as we're seeing right now, this war is rapidly escalating. And it seems like Israel, certainly, and the US at the behest of Israel, would like it to become regional. And for example, in each one of these theaters, if we look at, for example, the Kurdish issue in Iraq, if the Kurdish issue, if they're exploited and used to attack Iran and that whole area gets destabilized, that could also harm Turkey. And I think and obviously Iraq. So for Israel, that would be great. Harming Turkey and harming Iraq, that's perfect. For America, it wouldn't, arguably for any rational definition of American interests in the region, in the Persian Gulf. Same, let's say, in southeastern Iran with the Baluchis. Now, all of these ethnic minorities, first of all, I should emphasize, have legitimate grievances. They've been marginalized and discriminated against. But obviously, what the US and Israel are trying to do is to exploit them and use them to destabilize the country and region. So with the Baluchis, the same. That could also destabilize Pakistan. For Israel, that would be great. Definitely not, for Pakistan and arguably the US. And in the Persian Gulf right now, we're seeing with the shuttering of the Strait of Hormuz, it's not just that upwards of 40% of global energy and hydrocarbons get exported out of the Strait of Hormuz, but also what's imported is very important, particularly for these Arab countries on the coast of the Persian Gulf, namely food. And also what's very important is their water situation. These are very arid regions and desert regions, and they have desalinization plants. So another thing I would really watch out for that is very scary is that apparently today a desalinization plant in Iran, in southern Iran, apparently on the Qeshm island, was hit. And so if Iran retaliates by hitting a desalinization plant, let's say in the UAE, um, they don't have water. So this is going to get much more difficult for US allies. And, Iran's calculation has been by raising the costs in this way to get these allies of the US and to get other countries across the globe affected by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz to pressure the US and Israel to end this war. So their goal is a diplomatic solution. But it can get just a lot more ugly. And there's already been a lot of articles written and speculation about, can the UAE, can Dubai, can these economies that survive on foreign investment, that in this on foreign capital being there, which wants stability, which wants long-lasting security, is the kind of veneer or mirage of these countries kind of defeated in a very significant way, a long-lasting way? Like, will the political economies of these countries even be able to recover? I'm not sure, but regardless, if a desalinization plant also gets hit, at a time when, the Dubai airport has been hit, Burj Al Khalifa has been hit, various ports have been hit. People are paying $250,000 to flee Dubai. So these are just all longer term ramifications. And to Nargis's point, many of these Gulf countries, it seems like increasingly are very angry at the US. Like Turkey, Al Faisal, former Saudi intelligence minister, was on Christian Amanpour a couple days ago and was like basically blasting Netanyahu for starting this war and hurting these countries. And that's probably a sentiment that's widely shared in the Gulf, that this is a war they didn't want, and this is a war that their ostensible security guarantor, the United States, has unleashed upon them, which among the many reasons that this war will arguably hurt America's global position and strategic position is it's this credibility issue that its own ally, against the wish of these allies that are arguably much more critical to American global interests than Israel. this is the Persian Gulf, this is the energy base of the world, this is, the petrodollar, and they've been treated like this. So there could be many strategic consequences of this war, and Trump has just recklessly walked into it, and I think in a very blind way, led on by Netanyahu and the Israel lobby here in the United States.
Thank you, Sina. I would like to go back to a few things, and I know that Maya also will be asking about the broader picture. But first, Craig, if you can just share with us some clarity or provide some clarity on the question of strikes in the Gulf by Iran in response to the U.S. bases and their use in attacking Iran.
Yeah. So first, under international humanitarian law, you have this idea of the law of neutrality, where you're not supposed to target even military installations in a third country, in a neutral country. That's generally prohibited because of territorial inviolability, it's called. But there are exceptions. So since the US-Israel axis launched attacks on Iran, those constitute the crime of aggression. Under Article 51 of the Charter, Iran can assert its right to self-defense, and that can include attacks on facilities in third countries, so other countries of the Gulf, if those installations are being used, in the language of the law, to facilitate an armed attack. So if a third state allows its territory to be used by Israel or the US for military purposes, obviously for launching attacks, but it doesn't have to be launching attacks. It can be moving troops, maintaining communications infrastructure, facilitating intelligence, logistics. All of these violate the law of neutrality, and then that country loses its protected status as a neutral country. Those countries have an affirmative obligation in the law to prevent, let's say, the US, for example, from using their territory to support armed attacks on Iran in what is an act of aggression. And if they're unable or unwilling to do so, as the law says, then Iran can launch attacks against those facilities in those third countries, even if they're only being used for logistics, communications, and there don't have to be rockets firing from U.S. bases to make them legitimate targets in these third states. Iran can also attack them under this idea of hot pursuit. So if they're being used in those attacks and they are repelling those attacks, they can attack those bases as well. That's entirely lawful. Of course, when Iran does so, it has to also respect humanitarian law requirements of precaution and distinction and proportionality and so on. But it can legitimately attack those targets. And in fact, these states can become co-belligerents with the U.S. and Israel by providing military support to the U.S. and Israel in these attacks. And as a co-belligerent, they are then a party to the conflict and can be attacked legally. They're no longer neutral. Their territory becomes a legitimate theater of war as well. And in some cases where you think of Jordan, for example, which is actually actively using its military to actively engage in the conflict by defending Israel, by shooting down missiles fired from Iran toward Israel. Of course, Jordan argues that it's defending its own airspace, but Iran would have a legitimate claim in court, let's say, that Jordan has effectively has become a co-belligerent on the side of the U.S. and Israel by actively engaging in hostilities. Then you have, and there's a lot of nuance here, but I don't want to go into a legal lecture here. But that is to say, in sum, that yes, Iran can lawfully attack U.S. military bases and other legitimate military targets in those third countries because they are supporting the military of the U.S. and or Israel, but certainly of the U.S. And by the way, supporting them in an unlawful act of aggression against Iran, which only strengthens the Iranian case. Then you have your first question, Bassam, about these armed groups being supported and funded and armed and facilitated by the U.S. and by the Israeli regime to enter in, to amass at the border, to fire from the border, to enter onto Iranian territory, and so on. This is a matter that has been settled by the International Court of Justice already, going all the way back to 1986 in the U.S. versus Nicaragua, where the U.S. was supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. The International Court of Justice said that is an act of aggression. It actually rose to the level of being an act of aggression. It's unlawful. And in that case, Iran has a right to use force to repel those attacks, and is again being a victim of aggression. And even the more minor engagement of the US and the Israeli regime with these armed groups, even if there's not a direct armed attack, it's still unlawful because it constitutes unlawful intervention, even if it doesn't rise to the level of aggression, as many of these already have. So again, it sounds complicated sometimes, but it's very simple. Iran is the state that is being attacked in an act of aggression by all of these means. And these armed groups are participants in that, and also countries that are facilitating US and Israeli attacks by hosting their bases and allowing logistics and intelligence and communications and all these things to be hosted there. They are also making themselves party to the conflict. They can end this not by declaring themselves neutral, but by taking affirmative steps to prevent the use of their territory by the US or the Israeli regime in this war of aggression against Iran. That's their defense.
Thank you, Craig. Maya, I'd like to ask you to share with us some of the domestic responses in Lebanon to Hezbollah's actions, and how we have witnessed something that's unprecedented in terms of the government response, with Nabih Berri, the Speaker of the House, sort of weighing in as well. And I know that everything about Lebanon is shrouded in sort of not everything, but most things are not always very clear at the moment, and we will learn more as time goes by. But if you can just provide some as much clarity as you can for us.
Sure. I mean, I think with the caveat that this is still in development, and things will develop in ways that are unpredictable, and that includes public opinion. I think it's important to note that these actions by Hezbollah were met with, they were unpopular with a very large, probably a majority of public opinion, but unpopular in for various different reasons. And some of the reasons I don't think are being accurately discussed in US-based media and general sort of analysis on this. For example, the question of why now? Why after, almost 400 Lebanese people were killed, and after 15,000 violations, why not earlier? With people thinking that that would have been a more legitimate time of response. Why not earlier? Uh, so there's that. And then there is also the very open-eyed, somber public opinion on this, which says, even a slow death is better than an apocalypse. And what we were living under this ceasefire agreement, this slow attrition, slow occupation, everyday bombing, everyday people being killed, infrastructure being destroyed, that even that is better than what we are witnessing and what was sure to happen in terms of this attack. And then there are, of course, a faction in Lebanon who's the public and political opinion is that actually, the time is now to sort of end Hezbollah's autonomy or seeming autonomy of action or non-autonomy of action. And I think that the one thing I can say that I mean, I don't like to make predictions, but I think that going forward, this will be very different in Lebanon, no matter what happens in this war. the political calculation is going to look different after it. And I think one thing we really also need to pay attention to is that Hezbollah has members in the current government, as does their strongest ally, Amal. And they did not leave the government after these decisions were taken by the cabinet, nor was cabinet dissolved and reformulated following them. So I think that's an important thing to note, right? This is part of the unpredictability, which is that it's not as if these political coalitions in Lebanese parliament and Lebanese cabinet that are particularly the cabinet that is taking these decisions. And there's also reports of rifts, for example, in planning or decision making or understanding of what the role of the Lebanese army should be right now between the commander of the ultimate commander of the armed forces, who is the president, and cabinet decisions that were taken, and then leaked reports about army disagreement with those decisions. So I think that so much of this is really clouded and unpredictable. But I will say that as much as there was, the decision to launch these rockets at this time is unpopular with a very large part, if not the majority of Lebanon. Occupation is also very unpopular. And days before, again, the Israeli army stated that they were going to occupy these 5 points of Lebanon with no intention of leaving. And the more that this turns into a fight on the ground, the more that the public opinion on this will shift, particularly as it seems that the fighting on the ground, as usual, is not as easy as just bombing people from the sky, killing people from the sky, and destroying civilian infrastructure from the sky. That will change the calculus. And I really think that when we talk about public opinion, we're talking about many publics and many opinions. And it's important to keep remembering the things that I'm watching for is what is the political arm of Hezbollah and their ally Amal going to do vis-a-vis the cabinet, and the fact that they are still members of this government that has taken decisions that the Secretary General has called, and many people believe to be almost, one public opinion, that these are treasonous decisions that have been taken. And then the accusation of the rocket firing is that is treasonous. But what is still holding is the actual cabinet, its formation, its members, and they are meeting every day, and they are going to those cabinet meetings. The final thing I'll say about the unpredictability here when it comes to public opinion is also, I think there's only some that get reported. So this growing dissatisfaction, for example, between Lebanese vis-a-vis the Iranian government, that was a growing public opinion. But one of its drivers, which was unreported, were that people expected the Iranian government to support Lebanon more in 2024, particularly after the assassination of the former Secretary General of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. So all of this to say is that, just as Bassam said, we won't know for a while yet. Things are developing on the ground that affect public opinion every day. While the decision to launch these rockets was unpopular, occupation is probably more unpopular, mass displacement, and these are the conditions that people were living under. And I really want to point our attention here that a lot of this dissatisfaction with this decision is not naive. It's a very somber decision about what can people handle better: a slow death, a slower occupation, or these kinds of and what can the country absorb: slow death or these really apocalyptic, quick, acceleratory strikes and displacements.
Thanks,
And watching
Maya.
that.
Thanks, Maya. Before we zoom out a little bit, to the broader geopolitical dimension, I wanted to address the question of casualties during the protests that started in December 28th. There was rightly a lot of attention given to the civilian deaths and killing by the regime, regardless of any sort of, extras one might add to this scene in terms of other interventions by Israel or otherwise. And that insistence was rightly placed. Now, and it was actually addressed by all factions, whether you support, the protest or whether you were critical of the regime. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know today about the civilian casualties in Iran and the extent to which this is moving the needle, creating any sort of um, perhaps solidarity, tempering the position of a lot of the forces that we know exist inside Iran that would like to see a serious political change, if not regime change. Um, Also, curiously, if one follows social media, the very noted sort of muted response by those who advocate regime change from the outside, including some of the diaspora, if not a lot of the diaspora, their sort of muted response to the killing of civilians by Israel and the United States. If you can just address this, we would appreciate it, because we don't seem to have as much information on these numbers, even though they have certainly surpassed 1,000 or 1,500.
Sure. So the the massacres that took place in January 8th and 9th in Iran, the aftermath of it, um, I think the biggest aftermath of it that we need to really understand to understand this moment is that it created an extremely wide and deep wound between um, many parts of the population and the state. And the understanding that we have, the state itself has put out a number of around 3,117, I believe, there's a human rights organization, Human Rights Hirna, who has put out a number a little bit above 6,000 with verified names. Then there have been, and I know Craig talked about this a little bit before, lots of different numbers that have come out of different spaces, but without verification. This range that we have between 3,000 to 6,000 is sort of the ones with verified names. Now, regardless, it landed in an extremely heavy way across many sectors of society. And within that fold came in sort of promises of either help from the United States or promises of, as Sina was saying before, this sort of broader conversation that has been happening in Washington that Iran is weak and it just needs a push from the United States. That conversation also via a satellite television station called Iran International, which beams into Iran 24/7 and has captured in many ways the social media sphere in Persian, has been also reiterating a lot of these lines that are coming out of Washington and Israel. And they have captured a good amount of the public discourse, whether within Iran or within the diaspora. Um, Now, once the bombs started flying in last week, and in particular, as more heavy bombardment of civilian infrastructure has started to take place in crowded areas, you are beginning to see a shift in feeling from maybe all it needs is a push. Well, Khamenei got assassinated, and the country has continued, and more importantly, the defense infrastructure of the country has held up, and command and control has held up, and the governmental and economic infrastructure of the country has held up. So what that means is that actually this idea of all Iran needed was a push, or that all it needed was to take out Ayatollah Khamenei, has panned out to not be the reality. And instead, what people are feeling are these extremely heavy bombs that are being dropped in and around big cities, large cities of the country. And this weekend, Trump has promised the heaviest bombardment. So that is, you know, part of the tragedy, I think, of this time is that Iran has really, ever since maximum pressure started under the first Trump presidency, has been under a relentless first economic warfare, psychological warfare, media warfare, cyber operations, right? And then particular kinds of strikes, and then full on war last year, and then now this year on a bigger scale. And you have the massacres from before, just a few weeks before that, and that you also need to understand within this broader sort of maximum pressure era that we are in. So Iranian society, much like many societies in the region, has not had a chance to breathe and has not had a chance to like process from one catastrophe to another, to another, to another. Part of the current moment that we are in is that as the casualty numbers grow, we're already a little bit over 1,000, if not over 1,500 right now, casualties. As the casualty numbers grow, the fear actually is that, or like the tragedy of this moment is that what happened in January will end up dwarfing in comparison to what comes after. And I think a lot of people are really considering that, and also sitting with the heaviness of that. And that's sort of where, I, I think where we are now in understanding all of this.
Sina, can you please address this, and then I'll ask Craig to simply go right after Sina, if you don't mind, and address this topic in the context of another sort of more profound calamity, which is the genocide that Israel's committing in Gaza, and how we can relate the two calamities. It's something that unfortunately has escaped the attention of the mainstream media, especially given that Israel has been using what it has been doing and what it is doing in Iran to tighten the blockade in Gaza and wreak havoc and increase the level of violence in Gaza, but also the expansionist approach in the West Bank. So if you could just connect the two for us after Sina addresses the point about casualties, because there's a tendency to move from one thing to the other when we look at mainstream media, or even frankly beyond mainstream media in the United States, to sort of compartmentalize issues. And one of the main problems for the past several decades is that we do this as opposed to like zooming out and address these connections without falling into conspiracy theories, which no longer have to be sort of, we don't have to be so weary of them because people are telling you out loud what they're doing.
Yes, well said, Bassam. I think many of the failings that we've seen in the mainstream media regarding U.S. foreign policy, especially in these kind of misadventures America's had in the Middle East in recent decades. Most notably in the lead up to the Iraq War, where the American people were fed a lot of propaganda about what that war was about. Obviously the big WMD lie, but also that we would be greeted as liberators. And a lot of that playbook has really repeated again with Iran. And I think, a lot of the mainstream media and coverage deserves blame as well. This idea that, most Iranians were going to welcome attacks, there's going to be an uprising as soon as, U.S. military attacks has happened. This has been, I hope, definitively discredited, but I wouldn't leave it past these people to continue some of these narratives in some capacity. But I just wrote an article for The Nation, actually, highlighting all these voices that we never hear about really in our mainstream media here, like dissidents and opposition voices in Iran and civil society activists who arguably are the most grassroots, most organic, homegrown opposition movements in Iran that have been active for decades, pushing for democratic change, better governance. that, since the January protests leading up to it, they've always been consistently both against authoritarianism and repression of the Islamic Republic internally and pushing for democratic change, but also emphatically against foreign intervention, and this ranges from, female political prisoners. Like there's one voice I highlighted in that article who was there was this statement of numerous female political prisoners who blasted the genocide in Gaza and said that this country that is, complicit in this genocide, or Israel, they don't speak for us. They're not going to bring anything good for us. Or the mothers of Lale Park, who were the mothers of slain protesters in past protests, had, warned about foreign intervention, and Iran can go down the path of Libya or Iraq or Afghanistan. Or you have these big dissident figures in Iran, like Mir Hossein Mousavi or Mustafa Tajzadeh, who are former insiders of the government, but have become outspoken dissidents, pro-democracy activists. Mousavi is in house arrest since 2011. Tajzadeh has been arrested many times and is currently in prison. So you have these voices there. So this idea, that as Nargis said, this Iran international outlet that is very dubiously funded, like we need serious journalism about these propaganda machines that have now dragged Americans into this very war, and this terrible war, and deceived Americans. It wasn't just Iranians who've been deceived, but also Americans, the American taxpayer, Canadians, their populations, they've all been deceived as well. I mean, I think this is a key litmus test for their ideas. There haven't been an uprising. The people who were happy Khamenei is dead and all that, of which there are many, but now they're terrified. Everyone I speak to in Tehran, no one's welcoming these bombs. People are terrified. People are scared. People are evacuating. People are angry. Many people are radicalized. And Trump himself is just proving that he never obviously cared, obviously, like he himself, he called, very cynically, Iranian people take to the streets that first day, Saturday morning. Since then, he's been all over the place, regime change, not regime change, wanting talks, not wanting talks. But, yesterday he's like, oh, they can, I just want to interfere and influence this process of selecting the next supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. And they should take into account our interests, Israeli and American interests. And it doesn't have to be democratic. It could be a religious leader. There are plenty of good religious leaders, or that religious leaders that I deal with. That's what Trump said yesterday.
And he wants to participate in the vote.
Yeah, and he wants to basically interfere in this vote, which is obviously nonsensical. It's not going to happen. And I think, given that the Islamic Republic's base is so radicalized and angry, obviously, that any kind of next supreme leader that is kind of more, I think the chances of having a more moderate pro-engagement with the West leader are actually diminished, or politically, at least, it's more toxic for that base. So not to say it's not going to happen, or we'll see, I think, who becomes the next supreme leader, which, that might be selected very soon. That'll be very interesting to see, what that signals about where Iran is going. But yeah, I think, we've been told these narratives that have now been demonstrably been proven to be false at great cost. So I hope, we learn lessons from this, and our mainstream media learns lessons from this, and, serious journalists learn lessons from this to not be as credulous about these claims and be more skeptical, and really get to the bottom of, like, who are these voices? Like Reza Pahlavi, for example. Who is he? Who's behind him? How did he, the evolution of his movement, his advisors. And so, yeah, because otherwise a disservice is being done, not just to the Iranian people and prospects for democratic change in Iran, but also for the American people, American interests, and European interests. And we're seeing, the costs right now for the world that are playing out.
Greg?
Yeah, I think your question about zooming back and looking at the big picture is extremely important, Bassam. This is not a conflict between the United States and Iran, as it's often sort of painted in the West. It's not only a conflict between the United States; it's a part of a much bigger project. And if anyone zooms back and looks at Western Asia from a sort of intelligent distance, you will see that what has been happening here is a process of either corrupting, capturing, co-opting every government in the region in order to get them to submit to what is an Israeli project, what is a project that is, basically has the ideology of Zionism at its core, this deeply racist, fundamentally violent, supremacist ideology that seeks to dominate the entire region. And people love to have debates about whether the tail is wagging the dog or the dog is wagging the tail with regard to U.S. empire on the one hand and Israeli Zionism on the other hand. What I always say is it's the same dog. These are the same people, the same interests, the same oligarchs, the same actors that are infused throughout the U.S. government and elite society in the U.S. And the Israeli regime. And the only thing left standing between the full success, the full domination of the entire region by the U.S. empire and the Israeli regime is Iran, half of Yemen, and half of Lebanon. And that's why you see the gun sight so squarely on. I mean, the only governments that we have been over 2 years now witnessing what is cliche but is true, the first live streamed genocide in Palestine, where the whole world has watched every notion of international law, of decency, of humanity violated with absolute impunity. And the only forces that have stood up physically to do anything to intervene is the government of Iran, whatever you think about it, the Ansar Allah, half of Yemen, whatever you think about them, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, whatever you think about them. These are the only forces in the region that have stood up to the Israeli regime. Others have either sat on their hands or been directly complicit in the crimes of Israel. And let's remember, in addition to genocide, we're talking about serial aggression. We're talking about aggression against Lebanon, against Syria, against Iraq, against Iran, against Yemen, against countries across the region. We're talking about the occupation of 3 separate nations by the Israeli regime, Lebanon and Syria and Palestine. We're talking about acts of transnational terrorism with booby-trapped pagers. We're talking about bombing humanitarian ships in the Mediterranean. We're talking about a chain of assassinations across the region. This is the principal malign force that is driving all this in full partnership with the U.S. Empire in all of this. And all that's left is Iran and half of Lebanon and half of Yemen. And that's why we see this kind of violent action that's taking place now. The Israelis have been trying, and Benjamin Netanyahu specifically, have been trying for 40 years to get the U.S. to launch a full-scale war at their side against Iran. And they can't believe their luck in having somebody who is so deeply immoral and criminal as Donald Trump at the helm that they finally have their opportunity. And I think that those who insisting on resisting within Iran, within Yemen, within Lebanon, have understood that they are the final line against this expansion and against what will be generations of tyranny at the hands of the U.S. and the Israeli regime if they don't impose a cost enough to have some deterrent effect on the horror that we are seeing unfolding there. And I've said that they are not only attacking Iran and Palestine and Syria and Lebanon, but they are attacking the entire post-war framework of international law. And if they can succeed, if they can get away with the 2 principal crimes in international law, genocide and serial aggression, then that is the end of a weak and nascent project of trying to build an international order in which the rule of law has some bearing, in which international law has some bearing, in which international diplomacy and international cooperation has some bearing. And then we are back entirely to the dark ages. So I think that your point on zooming out and looking what's actually happening here is really important. And, just to say, it's not just the serial aggression. This is an axis of powers that believe that even the rules of war, once you enter them, international humanitarian law, need to be entirely dismantled. The strategy is to cause maximum civilian suffering the Dahiya doctrine. Whether it's in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Iran, this is not incidental civilian harm. These are attacks on hospitals and schools and civilian infrastructure intending to cause maximum civilian suffering, to bring the country to its knees, to cause internal disorder, to cause civil war, if need be, in order to ensure this very dark dream of Israeli Zionism and American imperialism in the region. So, even beyond the narrow constraints and complicated principles of international law, this is an existential fight for Iran. It's an existential fight for Lebanon and Palestine and the rest of the region and the rest of the world, whether it's the Western world, Europe, and their allies, whether it's the countries in the region that have already sold their destiny to the Americans and the Israelis, whether it's countries in the global South that have been co-opted through trade or technology or weapons sales, whether it's international institutions established precisely to stop this kind of, when's the last time we saw serial aggression and genocide and a world failing to respond adequately? Was the lead up to World War II. So I think zooming back paints an even uglier picture than the horrors that we've seen perpetrated over the last 2 years or the last several days in Iran, to something that is existential and something that is global. And we need to factor that into the way that we make our judgments about what should be happening in response to the threat coming from Washington and coming from Tel Aviv.
Thank you, Craig. Let me just ask Maya to weigh in on this. And also, I want to point out that the Iraqi social and military forces of various sorts are involved also in this sort of counter domination or counter hegemonic responses. I don't know if you said it and I missed it, but some of the recent developments in the past several days point to an increased involvement, and that is not to be taken lightly. Maya, your take on this before we sort of ask the last sort of closing question, please.
Yeah. I think that this war, the previous war, the war that is after this war, begin and end in Palestine, begin and end in the plan to colonize and settle the entirety of historic Palestine, and if possible, expand beyond it. And, when we say, even when I was speaking previously about this very somber sort of court of public opinion or faction of public opinion in Lebanon, this is the public opinion that is operating within the theater of genocide, within being witness to more than 2 years of genocidal violence with absolute impunity. And those are the stakes here. That people in Lebanon and South Lebanon know that nobody's coming to save them. Nobody tried to uphold the ceasefire or international law. There was zero accountability. The system is broken. And this is the, I would say, even terrifying success of genocide as a form of almost like foreign policy on behalf of Israel and the United States, and the impunity, the permission to commit genocide also. And I also want to note here, like, I don't like to use the term Dahiya doctrine, because it is the term coined by the Israeli military to describe a campaign of absolute destruction, an illegal campaign of absolute destruction. And just to note here that what it actually refers to, what Dahiya is a critical part of Beirut, very densely populated, vibrant part of Beirut, very diverse part of Beirut, also a part of Beirut that became what it is today by people, because people who fled the last invasion and occupation of Lebanon built it into what it is. So this is a further, and I'm talking here about the invasion occupations 1978 and 1982. And this is the So we have to really place things in a historical context, and we have to understand here that people are reacting, people are acting with the knowledge that there is no international community that can or has the will to impose any kind of pressure on the United States and Israel to uphold to uphold some kind of framework of international law. And I don't think we can. I think this begins and ends with Palestine in many, many ways. And the planned, as Nargis was saying, everybody was talking about that. The fact that you had the US ambassador to Israel basically condoning an expansionist policy on a live stream. I'm not sure that took off a lot in American media, but it was certainly all over the media. And everybody understands what those projects will entail, and that's ethnic cleansing. And those are the stakes that people are living with.
At this point, let me just ask everyone here if they would have, or if they have closing comments, because I know we've kept you close to, well, definitely 90 minutes so far. And if there is anything that you'd like to discuss before this session is over, because the area of topics cannot be exhausted by any one conversation, but I am sure that we have left a lot out, and I can bring up so many of these topics that I think we can still talk about, not least the broader question that Maya had raised earlier in private, actually, with me regarding Russia and China, or the other questions dealing with the actual strikes inside Iran, some of the dimensions of particular responses inside Iran, the kind of cohesion within the Iranian leadership, the extent to which whether there is a threshold of pain, also the threshold of pain for Israel and the United States, and how they compare in terms of developments, casualties, and hits. And Also, evidently, what's happening in the United States regarding the unprecedented, not just opposition to the war, but also something that is very notable if you're following all sorts of conversations and uh, publications, podcasts, and that is there is a significant contingency, and I don't mean significant as in small significant, but sizable significant contingency in the United States that is actually openly, explicitly hoping for the failure of the United States war, despite this sounding, kind of, at least in our time, right, compared to the Iraq war or the invasion of Iraq and so on. Maybe not so much compared to Vietnam, for instance, but these topics we can discuss later. But I'd like to ask you to close with your own remarks. And Maya, there's been a few questions for you on YouTube. I'm not sure if we will be able to come to them. I'll put them on your timeline if you want to incorporate them in your closing comments. And I guess this is total false advertising, because I invited Maya to co-host, given that Maya will be involved in a panel specifically on Lebanon soon, and I ended up abusing this request, and she was a speaker. So thank you, Maya, for being flexible. So Sina, Craig, and Maya, please feel free to sequentially address your or share your last words.
Yeah, I think this issue of the political fallout in America is very important. Like, I would strongly argue that this war is a quagmire for Trump. It's not going to go anywhere good for him. The political cost is just going to mount the longer he keeps it going. And as you said, in the lead up to the Iraq war, there was a lot of propaganda and manufacturing consent to get the Iranian American public on board with that. And, the Bush administration even bothered going to the UN and even bothered trying to make a case to the American people for many months. Now, and then, so Bush entered that war with something like 80 to 90% political support for it among Americans. And then it became the quagmire that it did. And it haunted all the American politicians and senators who voted for the AUMF in 2002. Now, this war, Iran has been demonized for many decades, yes, but, Americans weren't really primed for some imminent big war in the Middle East again. No one was asking for this. Trump arguably helped win this. One thing that helped him win was, he was kind of made himself to be the peace candidate or whatever. He was ostensibly against, these big wars and getting involved in a big war in the Middle East, certainly. And so he's entering this war with something like 60 to 70% public opposition, including in the MAGA base. You're seeing many prominent conservative voices being very skeptical of this. Put Tucker Carlson, whatever, he's been saying this stuff for a while, but Megyn Kelly has been skeptical. I saw Matt Walsh, like world's worst person, makes a good point. He said he was kind of skeptical of this. I was actually invited myself to Bill O'Reilly's program last week, just before the war. And Bill O'Reilly was interestingly against this happening and said he had talked to Trump and was pushing Trump to make a deal. So nobody in America really has wanted this. And now we see the price of gas is going up. The stock market is going down. America's, this war is not going anywhere. So there's going to be immense pressure on Trump. And it's going to be interesting to see also the Israel angle. Many people are much more openly criticizing Israel in this regard and saying Israel got us into this mess, including prominent U.S. senators. So that can have political fallout for the status of Israel in this country. That the court of American public opinion is ultimately very important. We know like apartheid South Africa, the U.S. was the biggest backer of that, and eventually that shifted over time. And I think it's significant that someone like Gavin Newsom is calling Israel an apartheid state, or many other would-be contenders for 2028, and politicians are using similar language and talking about ending arms support for Israel. So times are changing, and this war is terrible. The silver lining could be that it leads to many waking up and at least, for this next election cycle, to punish the supporters of this war electorally. And thank you so much for having me. I guess those are my final remarks. So I'll just say thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you. Craig, please feel free to chime in, and then Maya.
Yeah, I think absolutely all of that is true. What Sina is saying about some light emerging, at least in the United States. However, it is also true that the U.S. Here's a big surprise to everybody listening. The U.S. is not a democratic system, and the will of the people is not the basis of governance in the United States now, if it ever was. And so while it is true that increasing numbers of people reject the Israeli regime and its crimes, reject the war on Iran and so on, that has almost no bearing on public policy. And in fact, the most powerful levers inside the United States are still entirely on behalf of this, in supportive of this war, still entirely supportive of the Israeli regime and its genocide and its project across the region. This includes the two major political parties still, despite changes within the base of the Democratic Party. This includes the entire Congress that has just even rejected a War Powers Act resolution that would have only led to a discussion in the Congress that probably then would have endorsed the war actions of the Trump regime. This includes every single major media corporation in the U.S. that continues to disseminate the propaganda of the Israeli regime and of the military-industrial complex and so on. And so the levers of power remain firmly in the hands of those who support the genocide in Palestine, the aggression on Iran, and all of the other crimes that are being perpetrated in plain view. The oligarchy is fully on board. And just look, the U.S. has carried out these what are criminal attacks, despite the fact that they violate U.S. obligations under international law. They violate domestic U.S. law. They are contrary to the economic and national security and diplomatic and reputational interests of the U.S. They harm the U.S. in all of those ways. They are still contrary to the wishes of the majority of the people in the US. It's costing them billions of dollars in military spending. It is taxing their economy in ways that may be unprecedented in the end by disrupting global energy markets that are going to already are impacting negatively on the economy. It's jeopardized its relations with all of its allies in the region, many of whom had worked hard to prevent the Axis from attacking Iran here. It's put its own soldiers at risk. Many have already been killed, more will die. It's putting its commanders and politicians in legal jeopardy for the war crimes and aggression that they're perpetrating. You know, all of that is true, and yet it is perpetrating this crime. It is continuing to participate in the genocide. It is continuing to carry out criminal acts all around the globe because the people don't matter. International law doesn't matter. Even the interest of the U.S. don't matter because the U.S. government is captured by an oligarchic elite that is aligned with this enterprise, that is aligned with the Israeli regime, that is aligned with serial aggression around the world. So what that means is that we cannot depend upon those institutions. That this is really a case where it's up to the people. You know, there is not enough of a mobilization. Where are the hundreds of thousands that should be in the streets in the United States, in capitals around the West, opposing this war of aggression against Iran? This is what needs to happen. The reaction has been slow. It is bubbling up. I have no doubt about it. But this is a moment at which people have to seize the power that they have and oppose in all ways that they can the crimes that are being perpetrated by their government in their name. And until that happens, this bloody march of the US-Israel axis across Western Asia and across the globe is going to continue to the detriment of the people of Palestine, the people of Iran, the people of Lebanon, the people of Syria, and all of the people in those countries who can't afford health care, but they can see billions of dollars of their tax money going to support aggression and genocide and murder around the globe. Really is time for a historic uprising of people to try to put an end to these horrors. And
Thanks,
thank you
Greg.
for having me.
Thank you, Habibi. Thanks, Sina, very much for both of you for always joining us when we are looking for insights. And I'll get to Maya in a second. Let me just say that we lost Nargis. I mean, she's alive, but we lost her on the feed. And I would like to also thank her. And the one thing I'll say before I give the last word to Maya is that we will be addressing broader issues, sort of kind of like a laser beam at some point in the future regarding what this means for the United States as a state, as an empire, and as a people in this very interesting time of a rapid transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world in which the United States no longer has nowhere near the soft power it did, not even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, but before the attacks of 2001. I would like to ask Maya to share her last words, and thank you, Maya, also for being okay with being duped into being a speaker when I just asked you to co-host me. So, but we actually did need to speak on Lebanon, so I'm very, very happy and always honored to have you.
Honored, eh? So yeah, I was duped. I was supposed to be the co-host. I'm sorry to our guests that I ended up answering a lot of thinking with you all on a lot of these questions. But I will just say here
Can I
that
say something just so that people understand? Maya and I, along, of course, with the rest of the team, including Sinan Antoun, who was the subject of the documentary, actually entered Iraq right after the U.S. invasion in 2003. We were the first team officially to enter Iraq, produce a film on the invasion and various aspects of it, and actually it won quite a few awards. And we have seen this before, where we are opposed to the war on principle, regardless of what one actually feels or thinks about other aspects. And we've had that sort of uh, in the back of our minds as we are witnessing what is taking place today with sort of incredulity. So I'll just stop now. Go ahead, Maya. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, including the fact that people don't have any good options. I mean, these are not, for the people who have to live through these wars and these devastations, there are no, you know, good options for them. And they're operating within that deep-seated knowledge. And I think, just to go back to Lebanon for a second, this is precisely where some of the fractures are starting to take place, which is that people, the that living under these conditions, who is living under them, and what it would mean, what an acceleration of the condition that people were already living in actually means, and where its limits are. And just to note here that, things are changing very fast on the ground. Even probably by the time that we end this session, things will there will have been unpredictable actions taking place. So when it comes to Lebanon, I wouldn't, um, yes, there is a very divided public opinion on this. There's even a divided, which in my opinion is sort of more and dangerous in some ways, divisions that are starting to happen within political coalitions, that are both reflected and not reflected in the state structures. And we have to wait and see. But I think it's really just important to double down on the fact that there are no good options for people who have to live through this devastation. And a generosity with that, a generosity of how we analyze and think about that, within this very real knowledge, lived daily knowledge, is critical to all of these analytical decisions, because these are not theoretical decisions. These are the conditions of life and death, and the imposition of conditions of either slow death or fast death as your options, for people who live every day, communities, people, and societies.
Thank you all for joining. Thanks, Maya Mekdashi, Craig Mkhayber, Sina Tusi, and Nargis Bajogli have been with us addressing U.S. and Israel's unprovoked war of aggression on Iran. We will actually continue to cover what is going on, and unfortunately, it does seem that this will have ramifications that go way beyond the topics we are addressing today. We will be here, and thank you all for watching, joining, and engaging. Sorry we could not get to a lot of the questions because our guests will shoot me if I keep them longer than we're
I did
almost
want to
at.
know, sorry, but one question that you shared with me is just to say that
Tafadali.
when I said this about, there are many public opinions, that was the main point, and we shouldn't be concentrating or assuming that the only public opinion that is operating in the sphere of Lebanon is one that's being covered by mainstream media. That is absolutely untrue, and that's just it. That's what's
There you
to
go. We
do.
addressed one question. Shukran, Maya. Thank you. And yes, honored, eh? I am honored and very happy that you are all joining, and you as well, Maya, as a speaker. See you all soon under less horrible circumstances. And yeah, take care, everyone. Shukran to everyone joining us.
Bye bye.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.